Okay. Okay, and without further ado, I'd like to introduce Professor Bill Rolston, who will be talking to us about some of the mural history and how it affects us in the north and the south to a certain extent. All right, Bill, it's all yours.
Okay, Leslie, are you expecting about half an hour from me here? Is that the idea?
That would be perfect, Bill. Grand.
Okay, well, like any true academic, I will start by saying, yes, I will keep myself to half an hour, and then I'll completely ignore that and go on for 2.5 hours until you all fall asleep. No, don't be afraid to yawn very obviously. If it looks like I'm going on too long, I can take a hint. Quaylen, are you sitting outside, or is that just a, oh, well done. I was wondering if it was one of those sort of false backdrops you can get in Zoom. That's very impressive. Folks, I'm Bill Rolston. I'm a retired professor from Ulster University. I taught all my life at Jordanstown, mostly in sociology, although in the last few years I've sort of retrained in transitional justice and law. But I'm going to be talking to you about my hobby, and it's a dangerous thing to ask a geek to talk about their hobby, because you can be stuck there for the next God knows how long. I love political art. I'm not an artist. I can't paint or draw to save my life. But I love the ability of good political artists to take very complex ideas and put them into a visual where you just see instantly what the point is, whether it's a cartoon or a poster or a mural. And I've loved that for as long back as I can remember. And I do remember sometimes being at holidays in strange places back in the 70s or 80s where I found myself taking pictures of posters or murals. And so it all came to a head then in 1981 here, when Republicans started painting murals in support of the hunger strikers. Well, initially in support of the blanket protesters in the prison, which then developed into the hunger strike, if you know that history. If you don't know the history, I'll not really go into it here because it might take us too long, but it's easily found out in places like the Kane website, Conflict Archive on the internet, and various other places. Now, here's the point. 1981, as I say, I started taking photographs of the murals because there were so many Republican murals in areas where there hadn't been murals before, and so it was striking. And then I suppose two things happened afterwards. One was, even after the hunger strike, they continued to paint murals. So I thought, well, I'll continue to take photographs. And the second thing that happened was not so much a change in reality, but a change in my seeing, my vision, in that I realized that I'd grown up in a city that there were murals, loyalist murals. I'm not from a loyalist background, but you couldn't avoid the loyalist murals. In fact, you may not remember this, but I grew up in West Belfast. I was born on the White Rock Road. And up until the mid-1960s, there was a King Billy mural at the bottom of the White Rock Road on the Falls Road at Rockmount Street. So I grew up seeing these things, but no more thought of taking pictures of them than I would have taken pictures of trees in the street. They were just there. But the point is, with taking the photographs of the Republican murals, I then realized these other ones were worth looking at. And the rest, as they say, is at least my personal history, and that I've been documenting the murals since and writing about the murals. So I'm presuming that some of you know a lot of this story. Hope I'm right. And what I'm going to do is just take you in on this incredibly fast journey through that story. Here's the point. We've got the longest extant mural tradition in the world here in the north of Ireland. The mural tradition has been going longer than the mural tradition of Mexico. You know, you ask people about murals, and if they know anything, they sort of say, "Oh yeah, Mexico, all the big murals in Mexico." They only came about in the late teens, early 20s. We started painting murals here. Sorry, mid to late 20s. I meant. We started painting murals here in Belfast in 1908. First mural was painted on the Beers Bridge Road in East Belfast in 1908, and no prizes to figure out, guess what the theme was. Okay, you can all mouth the words silently. King Billy, yes, you're right. It was a King Billy mural in 1908. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start the slideshow here. So I'm going to share the screen and hopefully this works. Right, give me a second. Okay, there's where we start. So 1908, first mural, East Belfast, King Billy. Here's another mural that was painted in 1935 in the docks area of Belfast. You see it was repainted in 1965 as the picture shows you, it shows you there at the top right. My point is this, that if you look from 1908 for the next 60, 65, 70 years even, that's what murals look like in the northern part of Ireland. King Billy, White Horse, Battle of the Boyne. There were lots of variations on the theme. You'll see in this one, for example, that King Billy is accompanied by some of his soldiers. Sometimes he wasn't. Sometimes there were Jacobite soldiers, like a dying Jacobite on this bank of the Boyne. Sometimes it was very ornately painted, almost like a theatrical thing with curtains that painted the side. Sometimes it was much more simple. And a lot of that depended on the skill of the person drawing, painting, because for the most part, they were untrained artists. They were artists whose background was as house painters or painters in the shipyard. So if you look through, the following years, here's Derry in 1981. This mural, so King Billy on the left, on the right, you've got this the lifting of the siege of Derry, with the Mountjoy ship coming up and breaking the boom. But the point of it is that this mural has a really interesting history in that it was originally painted in Derry in a dead-end street in the Fountain area, a cul-de-sac, by a guy called Bobby Jackson, painted in 1916. When the area was redeveloped, they redeveloped the area and built this wall in the same area specifically to reprise the mural that was now gone on the wall. This area in turn was redeveloped, and there's a third version of this mural further up in the Fountain Estate, up near the little museum. So that's, it's had three versions, but in a sense, this is the longest, oldest mural in the north. So as you see, in 1981, I took the photograph, but they were still painting. This is a new mural of King Billy in Derry, painted in 1982. So that's the story, more or less. If you say, is that all they painted? The answer is almost. There were a few exceptions to the rule. One exception would be coronations or royal events. So here's a mural from the 1930s, again in the docks area, which shows, excuse me, coronation of George and Mary, King George and Mary. Beyond that, some other items, every now and again, would be a mural about the First World War. There apparently was a mural about the Titanic, which I've never seen a picture of. And the most surprising of all, and again, I've never managed to get a picture of this, there was a mural on York Street opposite the railway station, painted in 1945, which showed Stalin, what do you call him? Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill at the conference at Yalta near the end of the Second World War. So some variations, but really only one theme. On the other side of the divide, nationalists, Republicans did not paint murals. Many reasons. The shortest way to put it is, I suppose, that they wouldn't have got away with it. It was, to all intents and purposes, a one-party state here from 1920-21 right through to the 70s. The police was a mainly unionist police force. They policed the street according to, as it were, unionist rules. And culture, as defined, and especially public culture, was overwhelmingly unionist. While you would have had, for example, Republican or nationalist marches or Republican or nationalist events, they were much more restricted than the more effusive, outgoing public events like the 12th, for example. So in this, that's a very short version of a long story. But in that situation, there wasn't the scope to paint murals, even if you'd wanted to. And there's a little bit of an exception to that rule. At various points, some murals were painted in nationalist areas. For example, in 1953, there were a number of murals painted, including one in Ardoyne, on the 150th anniversary of the rising led by Robert Emmet in 1803. So some exceptions to the rule, some murals of Conley, James Conley, in the 60s and early 70s, well, early 70s, but beyond that, no murals. That changed with the hunger strike. Long story short, the murals were painted in support of the prison protest, the protest of the prisoners for political status that led to the hunger strike and the deaths of 10 prisoners before it was called off. Now, here's the point. To go back to my sort of, excuse me, that was a mistake. To go back to my sort of crude notion there that they couldn't have got away with it. They got away with it. Simply, there were so many people painting so many murals, youth groups in Ballymurphy, Beachmount, the Craigan, Bogside, painting murals that basically, I suppose that the state could not have stopped it easily, even if it wanted to. So from this point, a tradition was born. Obviously, what the Republicans painted about was about the hunger strikers. Here's Bobby Sands in the Craigan and Derry. Here's a mural at the bottom of the White Rock, which shows the dying hunger striker. Very Catholic in its sort of iconography, the rosary beads, the Blessed Virgin, the quotation from the Sermon on the Mount, so on and so on. In fact, most of the murals were much more secular, much more political, showing the prison struggle and the presumption that the prisoners would succeed, and as part of that success, you would get freedom in Ireland, reunification, freedom. They painted from the start on a range of themes, unlike the Unionists, who were sort of confined more or less to one theme. They painted more widely. So not just on the hunger strike, but when the hunger strike was ended, they painted political election murals. They painted historical murals, like here, James Conley, the socialist leader from 1916. They painted mythology, the great myth of the great story of Cuchulainn and his death, dying upright at a post. And they painted from the very start too on international themes. So here, already for International Women's Day 1983, on the Falls Road, a mural showing the women's symbol, a woman from Cumann na mBan, the IRA, in the middle. To our left, a woman from the PLO, Palestine Liberation Organization, and on our right, a woman from SWAPO, Southwest Africa People's Organization. So you see a quite different story, a late start, but sort of hit the ground running in terms of mural painting, in terms especially of the range of things that they painted on. So in the middle of all this, through the 80s and early 90s, Republican muralists also painted on military themes. So here you've got a silhouetted group of IRA men lying in wait for an operation. Hold that thought in mind for a minute, because it becomes very important at the next bit of the story. On the loyalist side, and I'm not saying loyalist rather than unionist, on the loyalist side, something happened in the 1980s. It happened mainly as a result of the Anglo-Irish Agreement of 1986, November 86, this sort of agreement between London and Dublin, which for the first time gave Dublin an official say in the affairs of the North, and the loyalists didn't like this. So you've got a sudden transformation of the murals. Now you got murals like this, UFF, UDA, UVF, Red Hand Commando, all these guys in their hoods, in their uniforms, with their guns, either posing with their guns or like here on the Crumlin Road, actually using their guns. Now, this was a sudden, dramatic and graphic change of tack. So you didn't get murals like this for the most part in the 80s, and even certainly in the 70s and way before that. For the most part, almost none. Now suddenly, in a short period of time, this becomes not just a theme, but it becomes the theme. Once again, on that side of the divide, the murals got concentrated in one form. Before it was King Billy, King Billy, King Billy, King Billy. Now it's hooded gunman, hooded gunman, hooded gunman. So there's a strange thing has happened through most of this story on that side of the fence, whereby there's a concentration of theme and iconography that's less pronounced on the other side. And the way I would put it is this: all through the 80s, Republicans were painting men and sometimes women with guns, something, by the way, the Loyalists didn't do. No women with guns. But at the same time, Republicans were painted on all these other themes: history, international affairs, current affairs, mythology. Whereas the Loyalists got focused very quickly. I mean, it's the ultimate cliche, but they sort of painted themselves into this one corner of paramilitary imagery. Okay. This, to me, was a mural from 1983, which more or less showed how much things had changed. A mural about Michael Stone, the graveyard, the Milltown Cemetery guy who killed 3 mourners at the funeral of the Gibraltar victims. And to me, it's very interesting. I don't even think it's tongue-in-cheek. I think it's deadly serious. It says quite literally, King Billy's gone. He's gone from the wall. So we got now? We've got a gunman. No more dead king, now contemporary gunman. If you want to have a hero, if you want to put a hero on the walls, this is who you put. Look at the slogan. You've heard of King William III, now meet King Michael Stone. So to me, that mural in Fane Street in South Belfast summed it up, how much the murals had changed. In this period, 80s going into the 90s, there were murals on that side of the divide on other themes. Not many, but perhaps the most common alternative was murals about the First World War, the Battle of the Somme, the horror of those days, the sacrifice of the 36th Ulster Division and other Irish regiments, especially Northern Irish regiments, at the Western Front. Now, what I'm saying is this, that already there's a difference between the Loyalist and the Republican murals in terms of the focus on military imagery. That changed again radically in 1998. With the peace agreement, with the Good Friday Agreement, the Belfast Agreement, what happened was that the Republican muralists, in effect, made a decision. No more men with hoods, no more guns in murals. And for the most part, they've stayed with that since 1998. There are 2 exceptions to the rules, as it were. One exception is memorial murals. So you can have a memorial to a dead comrade, which shows him or her with a gun. And the other exception is historical murals, like this that was at the border at Killeen in 2006. The IRA volunteer from back in 1916 with his rifle and his bayonet. Now the point, if you think about it, of both those exceptions, the memorial mural and the historical mural, is that they are not contemporary guns being depicted. They are old guns, guns from another era. So that seems to be the more or less rigid rule on the Republican side since 1998. You can paint your heroes. By the way, I put this photograph up and only realized last night, I had no time to change it, that I'd forgotten this guy was in it. This is a muralist from Bogota who was in Belfast and wanted to get painted, wanted to get pictured with a mural. His name is Robinson. That's his pen name, his writing name. So you can paint your heroes. That's all right. And you can, how should I put it? You don't have to spell out the military bit. So, for example, here it identifies Bobby Sands on the Falls Road as being, as you see at the bottom, poet, Kilgore, revolutionary, IRA volunteer. It's sort of muted. You don't need a gun. You don't need to scream and shout the revolutionary slogans or whatever in all their goriness or all their bloodthirstiness or whatever. But anybody who knows the story knows who Bobby Sands is and knows his connection to armed activity. But it's muted, as I say. So you can paint these memorial murals. I'll not romanticize the picture totally. There are still military images going on the Republican side, coming mainly from the smaller groups, which are called dissident groups, these small micro groups. So here, for example, is one in Weston Street in Derry, quite sinister one, which shows a police officer in a high-vis vest and flak jacket, and the rifle target pointed directly at his back. And you still get things like this stencil, which is in Clonard Street in the Lower Falls from the Continuity IRA, and it's clearly meant to be an IRA volunteer with literally a smoking gun. So you still get exceptions to the rule, but in the mainstream Republican movement, these sorts of things have not been happening for a generation now. What has happened is that Republicans have been able to continue to paint on all these other themes. They got a, how should I put it? They got a wider palette or a wider toolbox than the Loyalists did. So they could paint on all these other things, international themes, like here's solidarity with Catalonia in 2018. Here's 2 murals painted last year, side by side on Divis Street, what's known as the International Wall. One about the Kurdish fighters in northern Syria, this liberated zone, where they have up to 50% of the fighters are women. So here's one of the women fighters. And on the right, a mural about Papua New Guinea, where people are agitating for independence from Indonesia? No. I'm awful. Anyway, I'll check that one out before I give this talk ever again. So they've got these themes they can paint on. They can paint about Palestine. So here's one that's still on the wall. Some of these are still on the wall in West Belfast if you're going up that way. This one is about a Palestinian guy who, at a march to the border fence at Gaza, was hit in the legs by an Israeli sniper, lost his legs. When he recovered, he went back in his wheelchair and he was shot dead that time. On the Loyalist side, there's been a little bit more, through most of the time from 1998, a little bit more of an ambivalence about peace and about conflict transformation. And I won't put it stronger than that. I won't say there's a rejection, that would be wrong and too strong and wrong. But there has been an ambivalence, especially among some sections of loyalism. Interestingly, loyalism didn't do the Republican trick, as it were, of going mainstream plus dissidents. It tended to have sort of clusters of groups that were on message and clusters of groups that were off message. And so you would get now and again positive peace messages, like this one here on the lower Albert Bridge Road. Albert Bridge Road, which talks about peace. Remember the fallen from the war, but at the same time pointing out peace can't be kept by force. It's almost cut off at the bottom, but it can only be achieved by understanding. Now, that's a great message. That's a right-on conflict transformation message. I would say to you though that I couldn't show you a second mural that says this from that side. So it's a bit of a minority taste among loyalist murals in the last generation. For the most part, in strong loyalist areas, there's been a severe reticence about, if not giving up the actual guns, at least giving up the pictures of the guns. So for example, here's a mural in Mount Vernon, North Belfast, excuse me, that was painted originally in the mid-1990s, but when the flats in which the mural existed were pulled down and the mural with it, they built another wall between two houses. If you go to the other side of this wall, there's nothing. So the wall was built solely to reprise the mural again. So here you are, 2004, 6 years from a ceasefire. Sorry, 6 years from a peace agreement, 10 years from a ceasefire, and there's a mural where the UVF is telling me they're prepared for peace, ready for war. And I have to say, at the risk of sounding like I'm scoring a cheap shot, but I think I'm probably on safe enough ground. If you cover the word peace in that mural, there's nothing else coming out of that mural that looks at all peaceful. There's nothing that gives you a message of, relax, boys, we're heading towards a bright new future of conflict transformation. So this is the sort of ambivalence you get talking about being prepared for peace, but yet quite literally armed to the teeth and ready for war if needs be. The vast majority of loyalist murals from 1998 through for the next 10 years were like this: men with hoods, men with guns. There's been a fierce pressure on loyalist military commanders to change this imagery. That pressure has come from outside in terms of critiques and condemnations from other political groups or political parties. It has come from outside in terms of cajolery, as it were, for example, through things like the Reimaging Communities program. And it has come from inside the organizations too, where in some of them there have been quite heated debates as to what we should replace these murals with. For example, the one that I showed you back, this one, this was painted in inner East Belfast by a group of UDA people who are totally committed to conflict transformation. But I don't think I'm giving any secrets away when I say that the first obstacle they come up against in terms of painting out the military people and painting in murals like this is from within their own organization. Not everybody is on board in terms of replacing the military imagery. So that has been a problem for within loyalism. In as far as they do change their imagery, the question has to be asked, where can they go to in terms of themes for painting? Now, just to remind you, sorry for the repetition, but all good teachers tell you repetition is all about getting things to sink in. This is less of a problem on the Republican side. From day one, they had a range of things that they could paint on. So you pull the military murals out of the Republican repertoire, they still have all these other things. Pull the military images out of the loyalist repertoire, and they've got a problem. Literally, what else can we paint? So they've answered this in various ways. One is to paint on the Ulster Scots tradition. So here you have one in Boughton and Newtownards, 2005, showing up at the top there, Andrew Jackson and Andrew Johnson, two of the said to be 16 US presidents who were from Ulster Scots stock. I have to say, I'm a terrible person. I can't resist getting my own personal things in. But if you wanted to have some heroes on the wall, you would not really want Andrew Jackson, Andrew Johnson. Bad boys in many, many ways. But anyway, we'll leave that go for the moment. So there's Andrew Jackson, Andrew Johnson. Down on the right, in the middle right, beside the covered wagon, you've got Davy Crockett, grandparents from that's Daniel Boone. Davy Crockett's over on the other side. Davy Crockett, grandparents from South Derry direction, and so on. So, sorry, by the way, Jackson and Johnson, parents both born in County Antrim. In fact, not terribly far from where I am at the moment, near Larne. So you could paint on that. I will say, as a wee aside, that while there have been a number, a dozen and a half murals on the Ulster Scots theme, it tend to be a sort of a refined taste, as it were, in that not everybody grabs onto them. There is evidence that, for example, that while you could paint this in some places, if you wanted to paint this in the heart of, let's say, the Shankill or Sandy Row, and not a lot of working class loyalists would say, listen, what's this Mickey Mouse cartoon stuff got to do with us? So that there's a limit, let's say, there's a limit to how far you can go down the Ulster Scots theme in murals, in my opinion. If I'm proven wrong, I'd love to be proven wrong, but let's see. You can paint about royalty. So here, Derry and Bond's Place, you've got one of a number of murals that was painted in 2002 around the time of the Jubilee. Another one of them showed Diana with the what was it? Oh no, Queen of Hearts, it said underneath it. I should have showed you that one, but I didn't put that one up. That was on the Shankill. So you can paint on that, and you can paint on war, and specifically about the First World War. Now, this has become a huge industry now in terms of replacement of murals on the loyalist side. I would argue that it has its ups and its downs. In terms of the ups, it is transforming the murals from being solely loyalist into having the potential to be more widely unionist. And in making that deliberate distinction, to me, loyalism is the armed wing of unionism. And so if you paint loyalist murals, you're not speaking to all unionists. In fact, you're probably not speaking to the majority of unionists. The King Billy murals were unionist murals. They spoke to the unionist community. And so when the loyalist takeover of the walls happened in the late 1980s, they were transformed from being community murals to murals of part of the community. So it seems to me that there's some potential in the war memorials here to push that out a bit beyond just the loyalists. However, truth be told, it is a loyalist project more than a unionist project, to the point where, for example, not only will you have, if you see it, can you see my cursor moving here? Not only can you see your man, who's a regular British soldier, but you'd also see these wreaths to UVF volunteers who died in the recent Troubles alongside it, the argument being one of continuity. So it's still a loyalist message that's coming out here. I suppose if I could be slightly tongue-in-cheek, I would say that to me there's some progress in painting legal armed men on the wall as opposed to illegal armed men, but it's still armed men, and I'd love to see something else other than that on walls. But you get lots and lots and lots of paintings. You'll notice that this is another one with UVF and Young Citizen Volunteer symbols on it. There's an interesting development in this respect is that the UVF sees itself as being in direct descent from the original UVF from the start of the 20th century. They're not. The UVF originally was disbanded around 1921-22 after the First World War. The current UVF was formed on the Shankill Road by Gusty Spence and others in 1966. So there's no direct continuity. But the paradox is, if I can put it this way, if you're a UDA man whose grandfather fought at the Somme, you don't easily get the space on the wall to paint that, because people would be thinking you're painting a UVF mural. However, if you're a UVF man whose grandfather didn't fight at the Somme, you can paint proudly about the Somme on your walls. So there's a bit of a colonization of an idea has gone in there. I'll end the argument this way. Now, this is me. I'm a terrible cynic. Forgive me, but you don't have to meet me ever again, so I can get away with it, maybe. I remember various times when various things here, various cultural things have been touted as being the way in which we're all going to come together and walk hand in hand into the sunrise of a new peaceful Northern Ireland. It's been at various times George Best, Rory McIlroy, punk. Punk was the big thing. We were all going to unite through punk, and all our differences would be forgotten. Now, you could be forgiven for thinking we're in the middle of such a phase at the moment. So, for example, beside just down from the Prepared for Peace, Ready for War mural that I showed you, here's NHS Thank You, and a nurse or doctor portrayed as a super person, superhero. So that's on the loyalist side. Go over to the Falls Road, and the continuity IRA saying thanks to the NHS. I mean, duh. I don't know how to put that more academically except duh. So you've got these strange, how should I put it, bedfellows going on at the moment and this stuff. But you still, sorry, let me actually skip to this one. This is at the front of what they call the Felons Club in Andersonstown. The Felons Club is a club for ex-politically motivated prisoners. In fact, to be a full member, you have to have done time. That's how rigid it is. So what have they got up there? Great, supporting the NHS. But look at what it says, support our NHS. And think about it, what does the N stand for in NHS? National. Which nation? So, here's Republican IRA ex-prisoners saying support our National Health Service. So strange things going on, but there's still. I'm not sure this is the second coming. I'm not sure if this is the cure, and we're all going to be happy ever after, politically speaking. Go back to the one I showed there. This is on Donegal Road. We love our NHS, but then look underneath, no surrender to COVID-19. And I think that's how you get your cake and eat it, boys. You come out with this nice inclusive message that doesn't seem to harm anybody, but then you put that old slogan underneath, and you're showing where your roots are. You're showing where you're coming from. So let's put it this way: there's change happening. I'm not sure how profound or long-lasting the change will be. I'm not sure in relation to like everything else that they're talking about what the post-COVID world is going to be like. But we'll see what the post-COVID mural world will be like. Time will tell. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing there, and I'm back.
Bill, thank you very much. It was a really round of applause there, even though it's muted. Okay, Jude and Paul, we'll put it out to some questions from the group. Anybody, anything to say or a question for Bill?
Yes, okay. Jim. That's you unmuted 2 seconds, Jim.
Leave it to you, Jude, so we don't double unmute.
Is there anything on your screen, Jim, to accept to be unmuted?
Sorry. Hello, Bill.
Hi, Jim.
Bill, I'm wondering, you talked about there's sort of a strategy definitely within the nationalist or within the Republican thing about what murals should go up. Is there like a commissioning body, or are they organic, or what way does that work?
Yes and no. There's no central committee. This is not the Politburo run mural tradition, and on either side there's no central committee per se. Although, and I'll go back to this in a second, the loyalists come closer to that imagery. On the Republican side, there's a bit more freedom, or a bit more flexibility, right? Basically what it is there are a number of people who have been painting murals for a long time, and they from time to time attract others who paint with them, and so you get in effect mural squads or mural groups. So you can go to that mural group and say, give us a mural on X, how much it's going to cost. So you can do that as a sports club, you can do it as a historical commemoration committee, you could do it as a former prisoners group, you could do it as a political party, you could do it as an armed group, right? Now, that means that it doesn't go to a committee necessarily, although, for example, the one coming from each of these groups themselves may specify what it is they want, right? Now, interestingly, they don't always specify very exactly. They just say, give us one on da-da-da-da, and the muralists will come up with the plan, and then the group will say, hey, good, I like that, that's fine, away you go. So they don't arrive necessarily with a blueprint. So there is control in it, but there's no central Republican committee controlling this, unless, for example, it's the Sinn Féin murals or the former prisoners, right? They'd have a committee, probably. It means that sometimes on the Republican side, you'll get a mural that gets it wrong, as far as some of these groups might be concerned, and doesn't last very long accordingly. There was one, for example, when Sinn Féin was planning to go back into Stormont, right, with the peace agreement, and a mural went up in our Down which showed the road up to Stormont and Carson statue, and the whole way of the avenue was paved with skulls. Now that lasted about 2 days because it was clearly off message, and somebody leaned on the muralist to take it down. It wasn't fitting with what was about to happen. So you can get that mistake happening on the Republican side where something's off message and has to be rethought. On the loyalist side, there's much more control. And let me again make this distinction on the loyalist side. In the late 80s, when the loyalists when the murals shifted from being King Billy's to being military people, what in effect happened was that the loyalist commanders in each area took over control of the walls. And to all intents and purposes, up until now, still, you don't paint on a loyalist wall unless the commander gives you permission to, or even better, he commissions you to paint a mural. I was once standing with the loyalist muralist in the village, and this guy came up, who was pointed out to me later as being the local commander, UVF commander, and UVF, and he handed the muralist a sheet of paper with a drawing on it. And as he was leaving, he says, paint that. Okay, so that was a blueprint, quite literally a blueprint for this guy. So there's less space, there's less possibilities of, quote, political errors on the loyalist side. It is more controlled on the loyalist side. And part of this question of convincing people to paint something different on the loyalist side is convincing the commanders to, let me put it nicely, relax their control in relation to what goes on the walls.
Thank you.
Okay. Anybody else? Colette, did you have a question? Hang on, do we unmute you?
That's you. Oh, that's you now, Pat.
Thanks, Bill. That was really good. It's just really nice to hear such an interesting information on the murals. I'd like to ask you about the murals from the point of view of tourism and the different attitudes on each side. As far as I see, the nationalists or the nationalist murals seem to attract a lot more tourism, and a lot of tourism built on it nowadays. In fact, it's almost sort of become acceptable from the old days when people involved in tourism would have been told, don't talk about the murals and don't talk about the troubles. And now they're openly advertising them with Visit Belfast. But there seems to be a big difference between the interest in the nationalist murals and the interest in the loyalist murals.
Did you work in the tourist industry?
Yes, I do still work in tourism. Yeah. But I would be interested. We haven't really talked about it much in the industry as such, because we just make a living from it, and we are happy enough to take visitors where they want to go. But
you're a guide.
I train guides. I don't actually do a lot of guiding myself anymore, but yeah, I do a bit of training.
Okay, I won't interrogate you anymore, but yeah, no, you're absolutely right. Back in the day, I mean, I remember once writing an article about, I call it selling tourism in a country at war. And among other people, I interviewed the heads of like marketing in the Northern Ireland Tourist Board. And I was saying to them, you know, like, what if somebody comes in and says, look, I want to go and see them. Sorry, this guy's telling me, you go to the Giant's Causeway and you go here and go there and all this. I said, well, what about the murals? What if somebody asks in your advice place about the murals? And he said, wait, he says, we won't bother giving them any information. And I kept insisting. I said, what if the person insists, I want to see the murals. Where are they? Where are they? He said, we tell them there are better places to go to. I said, okay, I'm the tourist. I'm still insisting. Where? And he did this thing. He said, over there. This sort of dismissive, they're over there. Yeah. Sort of vaguely west with his hand, you know. And I thought that was very telling. Yes, you're right, that has changed. I mean, tourism and the murals they're up there as one of the quote products, unquote, with the Giant's Causeway and Titanic and various other things. Here's the thing. Why more? I think you're right. There is more interest in the Republican ones than the Loyalist ones. Why is that? Okay, I'm going to put this. If this is being recorded and this line is taken out of it, I'm going to have to go into isolation for longer. The Loyalist murals are worse than the Republican murals at all sorts of levels. Their range of themes is too narrow. Their iconography is often too boring. Their lack of color frequently is just not attractive. There are all sorts of reasons why the Republican ones are more attractive, just as a visual something on the wall. There's something more fundamental in this, and this is where I start to get a bit more critical. There's also something about people who, well, other than the bus tours where, hopping on the bus and it brings you to different places, including the murals. But if you go on a specific mural tour, you're already tapping into a certain type of tourist who's interested in those sorts of things. And I often put it this way. Nobody goes on safari in South Africa or East Africa and comes back and shows their friends all the pictures of the pussycat in the B&B they were staying in. They want to show them pictures of the lion that they got close to, or the elephant trumpeting, or whatever, So likewise, when people come here, they want this frisson, they want this feeling. Oh, look, here I was in darkest Belfast, and I survived it. And look, here are the pictures. So the sort of the attraction of both. Well, the attraction of the Loyalist gunmen murals is in there, but I think that, and even in that sense, the Republican murals are more attractive to that sort of troubles tourist.
Yeah.
Just last point from the other side. There was a time, I would argue that for the most part, I've always argued this, for the most part, these murals are painted looking inwards, as it were. They're painted for the community. They're painted to mobilize the community, to tell the community, look, this is our position on ABC. Are you with us? Da-da-da. So there's that sort of, it's a mobilization of the community as their prime importance. And so they're not necessarily painted outwards. They're, for example, frequently not painted on the edge of territory, speaking to the other territory. They're frequently painted in the heart of territory, speaking into the community. But of course, that has changed with tourism. And I do think that most muralists now paint with part of their brain thinking of what the tourists are going to think of it, right? However, I do know one Republican muralist who said to me once, he says, do you know what? The day that I wake up and realize I'm going to paint that mural and it's just for tourists is the day I stop.
Yeah.
Can I just come in there, Bill? What you're saying is absolutely right. And Colette, a lot of, as you said about going on safari, Bill, you're not going to go with somebody who doesn't know the territory. So a lot of the people who run the black taxi tours, for etc., around the murals, they're probably ex-combatants or have some affiliation. And the irony is, I mean, Bill, as you know, I've worked in the Shankill estate on and off for a few years, but much more probably in a socially engaged level. And, one of the first things the black taxi driver says was, when the community decided to bring some of their murals down, was, you're taking away our livelihood. The other irony is that the majority of the black taxi drivers who sit in the Shankill estate and a piece of waste ground, letting people off, are mostly from West Belfast and the Falls Road. Yeah. The other thing as well, when you go over to West Belfast, and this isn't opinion or anything, this is fact, they can go on the Falls Road, they can go to the likes of Culturland, they can go in and have a cup of tea, they can have a meal, they can buy books and literature. The Shankill Spectrum Centre tried to do something very similar with a sort of like a souvenir shop and a cafe, and it just didn't work. I've spoke to some of the let's call it the lads, because it is a very patriarchal society, about getting some type of container. Did they want to start some type of shop of their own, like some social enterprise? And it just never happened. So there's that difference there as well, where
Leslie, you're absolutely right. There's a huge cultural difference between the two.
Very much so.
We may watch the same TV shows and everything else, but there's a huge cultural, and I mean by that more of a deep cultural thing, which then has its expression in terms of how different communities are represented. There is less. This is awful. This is another one you're going to pull out and get me down with. There's less culture in loyalism, and what I mean by that is that there's less of a range of things that, there's a mural about culture on the Lower Newton Arch Road, and what is it? It's marching bands through the years. Now, if culture is just marching bands, you're on a hiding to nothing in terms of opening up all sorts of artifacts and debates and everything else. But if culture includes all these other things, then you've got more of a chance. And the Falls, I mean, you've not just got Culturland, you've now got the James Connolly Centre, which is actually before the lockdown, remarkably within a year of being founded, is buzzing. All sorts of things going on there. You've got more going on. What was the other point I was going to say? Anyway, there you are.
Yeah, I mean, and that mural. Sorry, me and Bill are going to have a
sorry, I started all that.
No, but you're right. Just the last thing was, that mural you're talking about. The actual slogan on it was "Culture threatens no one," and it obviously does. But anyway, right, Joe.
Okay, here the other one. The other one. You were saying about the Lower Shankill and the taxi drivers. The black taxis from the West Belfast are called the FTA, the False Taxi Association, and there's a big slogan on the Lower Shankill now in Hopewell Crescent or wherever there, it says "Fuck the FTA." So they know who the taxi drivers are.
Oh, they do, aye, definitely. Sorry, Joe, go on ahead. You were wanting to come in there.
That's you unmuted there, clicking your screen.
Yeah, Bill, I wanted to ask, do you think that the proliferation of murals has led to a greater polarization amongst communities? Because it seems, having travelled around and looked at a lot of murals in Belfast, it seems to be more about laying down territory, keeping people reminded constantly of the message that they want to portray, these people who are drawing these murals. And it just seems that in a country where we're get rid of symbolism and flags and that sort of thing, is there really a place for murals like that?
Right, thanks, Joe. I've done 4 picture books on the murals, and I call them all drawing support, which is a pun, which is or a metaphor, whatever you want to call it. Because to me, to repeat something I said earlier, I regard these murals about mobilization of the community. Now, of course, that is about territory, but it's not about territory quite in the same way as it might be in East Los Angeles or whatever, it's not. Anyway, but it's about drawing solidarity from the community. It's about persuasion as much as about enforcement, let's put it that way. So that's a general point. The other point is this, and this is a really good question. Part of me wants to say, look, these murals, no mural ever persuaded anybody to go and kill somebody. But another part of me says, why do advertising agencies spend so much money on advertising? It's a bit of a scattergun approach, but at the baseline is marketing people will tell you that advertising works, right? Not necessarily, you can't predict that this one ad will affect this one person, but somewhere it will affect some person. So these are advertisements. That's what they are. They're, so the notion that says the murals don't have any causative outcomes, I can't hold to that. So this is not quite the same thing to say. It's a bit more sophisticated than that, but my answer to you is this. I regard let's use that word again, the culture produced the murals rather than the murals produce the culture. The murals may reproduce the culture, but they don't produce it. In other words, the issue to me is not why don't we stop that mural being painted and then nobody will ever hate their neighbors ever again. The answer is it's because they hate their neighbors that they want that mural up. So it's a more fundamental problem. And if you're going to change it, it's not about changing the imagery per se. That's okay, that only goes so far. But if you change the imagery and don't change the mindset beneath the imagery or the mindset that wants to produce and consume that imagery, you've still got a fundamental problem. And it's the fundamental problem that we face here. That's quite abstract, quite general, but that would be my point. I'll leave it at that. If you're all right, Joe.
Yeah. Can I just ask you then? Well, say for example, you said about control. Someone surely must decide on the international wall, for example, what people is causes, if you will, are supported. For example, I did one of those terror tours, and I asked the tour guide, you know, who draws all these, who gives permission to put something like this up on a wall, and he said, I don't know. And so he didn't give me a particularly satisfactory answer, but in fact, he didn't give me an answer at all. There'd probably be more true. You know, for example, say someone came along and said, well, they wanted to draw a picture of Boris Johnson. That certainly wouldn't be sanctioned on that wall, would it? You know, so I mean, who is it that decides, for example, that you have a picture about Palestine? Who is it that decides that you have a picture about Venezuela or whatever it might be? Who does decide that?
Okay, so let's stick to the international wall. Boris Johnson is on that wall,
Is
incidentally.
he? Yeah, I haven't been up there, obviously, recently.
Oh, no, it's not. Excuse me, I'm wrong. It's his successor. Theresa May is on that wall. Forgive me.
Right.
Theresa May and Trump were on that wall as being supportive of the bombardment, the killing in Yemen.
Right.
Okay. You could. Okay. Nobody gives from first. Okay. Why this bit of the answer? Nobody gives permission for those murals. They're all non-permission. U.S. muralists would call them non-permission murals.
Right.
So you get permission for the most part. If you're getting funding from the, the Arts Council or Heritage or whatever to paint a mural about some historical event, then you will got to go through the correct things. But for the most part, these murals are non-permission. Mm-hmm. And incidentally, if you wanted to move in against them, right? You could get the muralists on various things. You could get them on lack of planning permission. You could get them on criminal damage to property. You could get them perhaps on incitement to hatred or incitement to terrorism. So there's a range of possibilities if you wanted to go after them legally. With one exception that I know, only about 15 years ago in Portadown, the authorities have never gone after muralists in that way. Okay, in that way. So that's the bottom line. They're non-permission in that sense. However, there is a sort of an unwritten rule which says if you use that wall or that bit of the wall, that's your wall, right? If you're a muralist, you use that bit of the wall. So if I'm a muralist and I want to use the wall, I'll not paint over your mural. I will come to you and say, can I use that bit of the wall? And you will either say no, or yes, or yes, but I want it back in 6 months because I'm planning to do one to commemorate such and such an event. Or no, but you can have it 6 months after this one's run its course. So there are different possibilities. It's quite unusual for people to steal each other's space, right? So that's not written down. There's no committee that does that, but it's quite unusual for people. There's been 2 occasions in the international wall where it's happened, and it was a bit of a standoff for a while. But it was between mainstream Republicans and dissident Republicans. It wasn't, no loyalist. So that's one thing. The other thing is this: no one in their right mind would want to paint Boris Johnson positively on that wall. If you want to paint Boris Johnson positively, the chances are either you do not live on the Falls Road, or if you do, you're very, very quiet about it. You're not going to flaunt it by painting a mural outside your front door. Okay, so you're much better off if you're living somewhere, maybe in East Belfast, and even there, I'm not sure sometimes. But anyway, let's leave it at that. So,
I mean, the nuances, Bill, are just
the what?
The nuances of this, between, like, if you're talking about walls and who owns the wall. The UDA and the UVF have a wall war going on constantly.
Yes.
And there is that, who owns this wall, and family memorials, which we haven't even touched on. I mean, it's endless, but so interesting as well. But anyway, I digress. Right?
Okay. No, you're right. It's because Joe started with the international wall. I've stuck with the Republicans.
No, absolutely.
You've made the point. The war of walls is more likely to happen on the loyalist side. In fact, back in the day, you knew there was a loyalist feud coming if you saw loyalist murals damaged. Yeah. It was the first sign. If a UDA mural had paint on it in the Sandy Road, for example, you knew that the guns were coming out in a few days' time, right? Mm-hmm. So it was a warning shot. So what was I was going to say one other thing to Joe. Oh yes, there's a word I like to use, a word resonance, right? When you look at a group of people and say, you know, what resonates with them about other places in the world? If you look at a Republican community, they're gonna find resonances with Palestine, with East Timor, with the, you know, Zapatistas in Chiapas or whatever, you know, because they see themselves as fellow victims of colonialism, imperialism, and repression. They see themselves as fellow strugglers for liberation and progress and da-da-da-da-da. Now, you can critique this all you want. You could say, look, you know, no self-respecting Zapatista would want to know an IRA man or whatever. But that's not the point. The point is not necessarily about real connections. It's about political resonance. So that's why, for example, you would get, not only would you get a mural about, say, Venezuela, although there hasn't been one, but you would know that everybody in the area would love it, right? So if you move to the other side of the city, you're not going to feel that resonance about Venezuela. So you're not going to want to paint that mural. And if you did paint the mural, you'd probably get it in the neck from the commander for not getting permission in the first place. Or you'd get it from the community saying, what the hell are you painting that for? It looks terrible Republican, you know? So it's not surprising. Without a committee, you still get a narrowing of the range of possibilities of what's on the wall. Okay. By the way, can I just say, people are sending up things on chat here, questions, some of which look like they might be to me. I'm an old person, I can't multitask, and I'm a man, I can't multitask very well.
I'm sort of being Jude picking those up, don't worry, Bill.
Well, somebody says, what sort of prices involved in commissioning a mural? Whatever, don't know. It depends on the size of the mural. For example, if you're, I don't know, a Palestinian support group and you want a mural, the chances are they'll do it for you for the price of the paint. But if you're, I don't know, a youth club coming wanting a mural and you've got government funding or something, probably the price quadruples. I don't know exactly.
No,
that's stuff, everybody.
Yeah, I mean, I remember some of the Republican mural up in, I'm going to call it RPG Avenue, Beachmount Avenue, sorry. And there was a bronze memorial done of soldiers from about the 1916 Easter Rising, and it was an artist I know who was in Conway Mill called Hugh Clausen, and they actually paid him. They done a commission, and they paid him the bronze and stuff. Not a great amount of money, but that was the actual organisation paid them because they wanted something quite substantial. But as Bill says, usually with a mural, a painted mural, it's usually just the price of the paint and maybe a couple of £100, just depending. Yeah. The likes of Danny Devaney, who has made quite a successful career out of mural painting, has branched out and would have done a lot of the murals and likes of the Duke of York entry, etc. He's made a living out of that. But probably back in the day would have done it for, because they were asked to, and they had a talent. There would have been very little money changed hands, and the same with the Bogside painters as well. They've become much more established, but at the beginning, they would have done it. There would have been a lot of for love or for it's because that's what they wanted to do, rather than as a career. Would that be about a fair assumption?
I would say here, Leslie, that nobody, yourself included, got rich out of painting murals in Belfast.
No, not.
There has been in more recent years the possibilities of commissions for stuff like some of the reimaging stuff that you and others have got, which is less open to the more, don't get me wrong here, the ones who have a more political reputation, the ones who've been known to be painting pro-Republican or pro-loyalist murals, don't access those commissions nearly as easily.
No.
I do remember the Sandy Row King Billy that Ross Wilson did. I remember finding out the price of that, and I told Danny Devaney, and he said, "What? He says, I could do you 2,000 murals for that. So there's big money, relatively speaking, and it doesn't all go to the artist by any means.
No.
But big money in some of these commissions now that was never there. In the early days, for example, of the Republican murals, they went around the houses asking for paint, for leftover paint. And so you'd get emulsion and gloss and God knows what else all mixed up together. Whereas now they usually get at least the money for acrylic, for good acrylic paint, which makes so much difference.
Mhm.
Sorry, Bill, Keelan, she has put on the raise your hand emoji. Not sure. I'll unmute you here.
Whelan?
Hi, it was just a wee anecdote. Actually, you've already answered the question I had. But at the opening of the 25th anniversary of Fela, Robert Bala was the speaker, and he recalled having to judge the murals. And just when you were saying about skill levels on either side, you know, he said he asked two of the painters who'd painted one particular mural on the falls, you know, guys, why are they always wearing balaclavas? We can't see their faces. Is this, you know, do you want them to remain anonymous, or what's the idea behind that? And it just says, no, Bobby, it's because we can't do faces. So, that was a good anecdote, maybe.
A young muralist in Andersonstown said that to me once. The equivalent on the other side is King Billy's horse. Yeah. I always said King Billy did people, muralists, no favours by crossing the bound on a horse. If he'd waited, it might have been better, because if you go back to all the old paintings, sometimes this horse looks right, but sometimes it looks like an overgrown terrier. It's, as someone who doesn't paint, I shouldn't take the piss out of people who can't paint horses, but I would say it's a difficult enough thing to paint.
Yeah.
I mean, that's always been sort of the adage, you know, that you know, the loyalist murals weren't, you know, as accomplished, I think I say. But then, as a rule of thumb, as we're always quite good, this is my opinion, you know, Republican and nationalist areas always embraced culture in a different way, because the Protestant, this is a very, very sort of, you know, loose opinion. The Protestant sort of loyalist unionist communities would have had industry and jobs, and you know, the sort of Republican nationalist, they would have had a different type of career. You know, you had this is a very, you know, solicitors, publicans, etc. You know, or mill workers, or whatever, to a certain extent. So they would have embraced and kept the traditions of culture, you know, of song, poetry, writing, painting, much more alive than some of the other communities. I mean, even I found that growing up as a, you know, a kid in the 80s, and I was always a class of town drinker. So I'd always had a lot of friends who were, you know, Catholic, and they always seemed to be much more talented. You know, there was always somebody who was able to dance, or somebody who was able to play the piano, or, you know, or they were a writer, or they were an actor. You know, and that was just, and they would have came from pretty much working class backgrounds. I mean, that's only my experience, but it's been a fairly constant that I have, you know, come across over the years. And again, that's just in my experience.
There's a religious thing in there too, and I mean literally religious thing, doctrinal thing. You know, if you take a more sort of fundamentalist view, then dancing and all these sorts of things are too frivolous. You know, like, you know, why would you ever want to get up to that? So if you put sort of a business hard-headedness along with a fundamentalist religious sort of view, you're not creating a very fertile field there where cultural things would sprout, you know?
Yeah. Okay. Is there anyone else has anything? Yeah. Or have we got onto your soapbox too much today for you all?
Jim, I've unmuted you there.
Oh, Jim?
No. Try again.
Nope.
I think you need to click on mute in your screen there, Jim. Sorry, we still can't hear you.
A couple of things going through my head here. And one is, you know, you talked about the expression of the unionist culture. You know, if you talk about this Ulster Scots tradition, even maybe the emerging Irish language tradition, the whole thing about the Enlightenment and stuff. Where is that expressed in the communities that it relates to, or is it just not fertile there for it?
Where's it in the unionist communities?
Yeah, but where's it expressed? You don't get. Is there any murals out there about the Ulster Scots and the?
There've been about 12.5 Ulster Scots murals over time. I showed you one of them there from Newtonards. Most of them sort of relate to presidents like James Buchanan and Andrew Jackson, Andrew Johnson. Even Teddy Roosevelt was from an Ulster Scots background. So there have been murals on the presidents. There's been a couple of murals about migration, immigration. There's one that was in Newtonards, which had this. It could have been an Irish colleen standing by an old cottage, half-door cottage, looking out to sea and thinking she's going to have to immigrate. And so it was an Ulster Scots supported one. So you do see things like that. But here's the thing. I think what is significant frequently on the unionist side is a lack of expression, which comes from two sources. I think this is a real shorthand way of putting it. And it's lack of opportunity or space to express. And it's also lack of knowledge.
Yeah.
Now, I'll give you an example. Now, this is slightly tongue-in-cheek, but I'll give it anyway. During the 80s, there were at various times about 4 or 5 loyalist murals that had this great quotation. As long as 2 or 3 of us survive, we shall never give in to the rule of the Irish, because it is not riches or fame that we fight for, but the freedom of our people. That's more or less what the quotation said. That quotation is from the 13th century. It's the Declaration of Arbroath in Scotland, where the bishops, Catholic, because there was no Reformation yet, bishops of Arbroath got together and had a declaration, and they sent it to the Pope, who had excommunicated Robert the Bruce, and they sent it to the English king, who was after Robert the Bruce, right? So why would the bishops have said, as long as 2 or 3 of us remain alive, we shall never give in to the rule of the Irish? They didn't. They wrote, we shall never give in to the rule of the English. And the loyalist muralists changed that word. So I used to challenge them and say, put the right word back in and paint that, right? Now, firstly, they didn't know it was the Declaration of Arbroath and the background story till I told them. And secondly, they wouldn't have got away with it if they put the word English in, you know. So that's what I'm saying. There are problems about space opportunity, and there are also problems about knowledge. I mean, for example, in every group of people, every ethnic group, every national group needs a myth of origin, right? At least there's some myth about here's who we are and here's where we come from. Unionists have it easy because you don't have to invent an origin. You have it. They came here in the plantations. The bulk of their ancestors came here in the plantations. It's a ready-made myth of origin. I have only in all the years ever seen one mural about the plantations. One, right? So what is it? There's you know, it seems to me that sometimes when you say to unionists and loyalists, in some history, what you get is these 2 bookended battles. You get the Boyne and the Somme, and nothing before, during, or between, or since. And yet there's just an incredible history there. And some of it is quite challenging history. First President of Ireland, Gaeilgeoir, Douglas Hyde, Protestant. How do you paint him? You know? So, anyway.
There is that patriarchal thing about it. I mentioned it before. You know, a lot of that history is male driven, and I suppose that comes from a religious perspective as well. You know, you've seen as far back as the 80s, some of the murals Bill was showing you about International Women's Day. That really wasn't celebrated even now. You know, not even talking about murals as much in the you know, in the society, if you know, sort of like Protestant Unionist sort of society. Certainly not as much in the Loyalist society. you know, loyalists when it coming across. I like the way you make that distinction between unionists and loyalists as well, Bill. We're so used to saying these acronyms that come up, you know, PUL or PLU and stuff. You know,
I hate it so much.
I know,
and I hate even worse the other one, CNR. I mean,
yes, yeah. Anyway, we're digressing here, so we are. So anyway, right. Anyone else have any questions? Are we good? Hopefully we haven't bored you too much. It's okay. All right. Well, listen, just before we head off, Judy, happy enough with everything? Yes, recording wise? All right. You know you can ask questions on Slack and keep sending your images in. Next Tuesday, I think, is our last session, the 2nd of June. So I need, we'll do a bit of a show and tell, and I'll go around everybody, and maybe if you have some of your stories prepared, we can do literally a show and tell. It'll be like going back to school for you all. So, you know, and I know that this sort of is slightly off what we've been talking about with postcards and imagery and political imagery, but it sort of does fit into the overall title of the project, which is Conflict to Peace, which we'll probably be developing as well. So keep your eyes posted for future online projects, as I say. We're going to run this project again, and then within the two groups, we're going to amalgamate all your images and stuff. But I'll talk to you about that next Tuesday in more depth. So are you all happy enough? Okay, right. Thank you very much, and thank you, Bill.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it. Okay.